Asia Education Foundation provides school leaders, teachers and students with global perspectives and fosters intercultural mindsets across the Indo-Pacific. The Australia-India Institute fosters research collaboration and people-to-people links across Australia and India, focused on global challenges, of which education is one. We are therefore delighted to partner today to bring you the second in our Education and Equity series, focused on gender. The first was focused on access and technology, and this session will be followed by the next in the series on wellbeing. So first of all, as I am now currently based in Canberra, thanks to COVID, I would like to offer a welcome to country from Canberra ACT. For those who are coming to us from Indonesia, Thailand and India, we incorporate welcoming and acknowledgement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and custodians of their land. It promotes an awareness of the past and the ongoing connection and the place of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians in current and modern day life. In Canberra, the Ngunnawal people made this their region and home 20,000 years ago. And Canberra, the name, actually means meeting place. People from other tribes travelled to this territory and offered gifts as a symbol of respect and acknowledgement of the territory and tribe they were visiting in return. Hence the term meeting place, but also commencing Canberra's role as the diplomatic centre of Australia. I would like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders both past and present. So today, as I mentioned, we are focused on education and equity through a gender prism. So why is gender important? Looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, you'll see that education is Sustainable Development Goal 4, gender equality is Sustainable Development Goal 5, and decent work and economic equalities is Sustainable Development Goal 8. However, obviously with these 17 goals, none of them can be looked at in isolation. As a recent appointee to the Australian official G20 Women's Summit, I've been taking an even closer look at the gender dimension of education, because without access to education, gender equality falls by the wayside. Today we come just in the midst of a COVID recovery, a slow recovery, where we've seen in 2020 a massive impact both on education and on gender equality. Equitable access to education in 2020 was negatively exacerbated, with 90% of students worldwide unable to attend school physically and remote learning not available as an option for 500 million students. Girls in lower income countries were even more disproportionately affected, with household chores increasing at the risk of being able to attend online, and many of the women being frontline workers as well. With gender equality, again, there have been gains in fewer girls being forced into child marriage and more women in leadership roles. However, many goals remain unreached. As an example, 25% of global parliamentarians are women, so still about a quarter or less. This series focused on gender and education, we really want to highlight the representation and role modelling that happens in schools as an important part of what we teach in schools, not just the curriculum, but who teaches and what the role modelling represents to young minds. We understand that a multidisciplinary approach is needed, and that's why today we've taken a multidisciplinary approach to this panel. We have pedagogical experts with us, the leaders and implementers of school systems, tech entrepreneurs, the product of Australian and Indian school systems, and policy experts, the guiders and influencers of Australian and Indian school systems. For those in the audience, I just want to highlight that this session is being recorded. It will be a 60-minute panel ably moderated by my colleague Hamish Curry, followed by Q&A. For those in the audience that would like to ask questions, please do use the Q&A function and we'll be able to get to your questions at the end of the panel session. I'd now like to turn to Hamish, the Executive Director of the Asia Education Foundation at AsiaLink. Hamish is passionate about education, has had several decades in building intercultural knowledge and skills of Australian students and in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you and welcome, Hamish.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And likewise, it is absolutely wonderful to be in this equity education event with you again, and your incredible work that you do as well on behalf of the Australian India Institute in Delhi, and of course your work too coming up with UN Women. I would like to also extend a very warm welcome from Wurundjeri country here in Melbourne. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and the Indigenous people and their land and waterways that we come from here in Victoria. This is a very special event, bringing together a range of wonderful and passionate experts. And we want to get a really powerful discussion going about the role of gender and the different lenses that we can view it through. I'm going to now introduce our panelists and give you a sense of some of their expertise and their passion. First up, I'd like to welcome Chris Buswell. Chris is a STEM leader at Mountain Creek State High School, and he was which is actually on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. And Chris was actually named as the Queensland Teacher of the Year in 2019, and then awarded a Commonwealth Bank of Australia Teaching Fellowship in 2020. Chris leads his school's critical thinking strategy as the higher order thinking coach, developing pedagogical practice and expertise within his school and the region. Chris has also been a team leader as part of the PNG Australia Secondary Schools Initiative, also supported by AEF, aimed at promoting equity, cultural understanding and leadership in STEM education between Papua New Guinea and Australia. Chris has also developed an immersive virtual reality chemistry resource, and his team recently won a silver award at the Global Reimagine Education Awards. Next, I'd like to welcome Sanjay Yadav. Sanjay has a flair for managing multiple responsibilities as a true school leader, as I'm sure you'd all appreciate. He has a postgraduate in physics with a specialist in electronics. And Mr. Yadav also holds a postgraduate diploma in space sciences and has a huge passion for space sciences. Sanjay has been actively involved in the development of national subject matter and certifications and training, with 29 years of experience across institutions in India and abroad. Sanjay has written articles on various educational aspects, including series of articles popularizing science as well as parenting tips. Next, I'd like to welcome Damian Aldridge to our panel. Damian is a STEM education evangelist and is the education director of STEM Punks. He has been teaching for over 10 years and is the winner of the Telstra Business Awards in 2019. And in 2020, he was recognized as a global education influencer and recipient of the Global Teacher Award. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us, Damian. Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Mary Lee. Mary is a senior lecturer based in the Continuing Vocational and Educational Policy Research Hub at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne. She has made significant contributions to the development of evidence-based government policy in Australia through commissioned research reports for governments and non-government organisations. Her recent research projects have examined transitions within education and between education and employment, the nature of vocational education, young people's decisions about tertiary education, and often through the lenses of gender. She's also the lead chief investigator of an Australian Research Council funded project exploring the history of trade union education in Australia. I'd also now like to welcome Malika Bajaj to our panel. Malika is a global media entrepreneur, sportscaster, and member of the Alumni Council for the University of Melbourne. Malika did not grow up knowing actually she would become a media professional, but she established her own company at age 23, Little Yellow Beetle Media, which functions in a sort of dual focus of digitizing India and connecting India to the digital globe. Malika was named as a Women Entrepreneur of the Year in 2015 and is also a National Youth Parliament Ambassador. She's also a global scholar and young leader named in 2011 and headed for so many more wonderful things. We're absolutely delighted to have you with us, Malika. And finally, we were to have Nishta Satyam join us for today's panel, but unfortunately we've just heard that she's not able to join us. at this point in time, which is a real shame, as particularly her experience as the Deputy Country Representative for UN Women. I know that Tanya, who's there, will also be perhaps adding some lovely other ways that you can link and learn about the work that Nishta has done. She is an absolute powerhouse in terms of her work in this space. So we do apologise that Nishta is not able to join us for today. But we're going to now get into the nature of this discussion. And there's going to be a lot of different things to talk about. I'm actually going to come to you first, Chris, for the first question. We're going to start at sort of the teacher end, and then I'm going to come to you, Sanjay. So Chris, can you tell us about what's been your experience of the value of role models, particularly in the STEM teaching space?
Thank you for having me, Hamish, and great to be a part of such a extensive panel. So in terms of my teaching, I've been teaching now for 15 years. Role models are absolutely key, but it's not just having the role models there, it's teaching kids how to identify what makes a role model that they can strive to be, that they can strive to become, the specific traits that they have that are valuable. Kids don't know how to access that often. We see girls, especially in our environment, they aspire to be doctors, they aspire to be STEM-based careers, but they don't know how to access those specific role models. They're not as present in their social media feeds. They're not present often in the school environment. So our jobs as teachers is to really improve the accessibility. I'd like to talk about my experience in role modeling in terms of the PNG Oz partnership. So something I was very fortunate to be a part of. That particular partnership was really about empowering the leaders of the future in PNG and Australia with a specific focus on girls' education. And I've talked to one of the leaders from Australia Awards, Anna Antonievich, about her work with leaders within PNG at the student level, but also the teacher and beyond. And what she's found is that these particular ladies, they need to know that it's possible to take steps forward to become something that they once dreamed of as being impossible. So three things that she really accentuated to me was this idea of making sure that you've got a tribe. That tribe is about role models in your immediate environment, your peers, making sure that your family supports that role modeling behavior, and that you can be comforted by that tribe, and they can empower you to move forward. Really importantly is knowing the value that you have as an individual. In particular, we got to meet a lady called Crystal Kewa, who started up a business in PNG at 15 named Chryson, and she's now a worldwide technology leader. We got to see how much she understands the value of what she can bring to the Papua New Guinean economy. And I mean, now her company Chryson is now developing the new voting system for the PNG democratic future. So the last thing that she said is to know your superpower. And I think students as a whole don't often think about how they can grow and change as they go through their education, and they're very static in nature often. So knowing your superpower is about reaching out and looking for traits that are going to be desirable, not just those 21st century skills, but the deeper context as to how you're going to use them in our really interconnected global world.
Thank you so much, Chris. Look, a really powerful way to start. And certainly I think your experience through the PNG Australia Partnership Program just highlights that opportunity is often a large chunk of the way of helping students, particularly female students, with an opportunity to do something that has always been there. They just needed the invitation, the platform and the experience and the access to do that. Sanjay, I'm actually going to come to you next with a question, particularly now hearing from the other side in India, and given your experience in education, I'm interested to hear from you. How does the curriculum promote women empowerment across different disciplines, but particularly in the area of STEM, and particularly given your science background, what have you seen through your experience in schools?
Thank you. So when we are talking about number one, the empowerment of women. There's one principle which we revolve around, which is for boys and girls when we look at it. A fundamental principle which I emphasize on everybody needs to follow, that if we educate a boy, we educate an individual. But when we educate a girl, we educate a family. And its implication is in terms of building the nation. So you can look at the power of the statement here, and it signifies the need of educating our girls. Living in a country which is so diverse in its nature. If I am sitting in the capital city in Delhi and I'm talking about what I observe or what I experience here, has to be matched with what is happening pan-India. A country most of you have been exposed to, you have either read about it or you have heard about it, and the contributions are well known. But when it comes to imparting, there are a lot of stakeholders who are involved. It begins with individual to family to the educators to the policy makers, and ultimately we have to look at what is being delivered. We believe in one thing very strongly, that there is nothing which a boy can do and a girl cannot do. The reverse may not be true, but anything which a boy is capable of doing is a girl is equally capable of doing it. Yes, over the period of time, as the development of education has been happening, as the contribution has been happening, the society has been dividing roles, which is from the history we have visualized it. There's no denying this fact that the society has not been discriminating as far as the roles are concerned, and that reflects in the upbringing of boys and girls. So somebody had very rightly mentioned that if it is a STEM based toy, which is given to a boy, assuming that yes, he has the aptitude and he is going to learn and he is going to do a better justice to this, and this will reflect in his lifestyle. On the contrary, the girls, they were exposed to different toys which could be related to some household, maybe the kitchen appliances, or it could be a Barbie doll, or a perception which had been there in the society over a period of time. But rightfully, I'm so happy to see the growth and development which has happened, that I give the entire credit to the girls, that they have taken that step forward, used every opportunity which came their way, and rightfully claimed their place. So today, be it in our armed forces, be it in our research and development, be it in education, be it in any field you name, it's not just that girls were meant for certain specific professions, like maybe teaching was one of the easiest options which was conveyed by the families. When it comes to doing a course like B.Ed, it is an obvious choice. Parents, they do say, tell their girls that yes, you enroll for B.Ed, so that later on, eventually you have the responsibility of the family. This is what is ingrained in them repeatedly. And teaching is one profession. I strongly object to that, because people may undermine the potential of teacher and the input which a teacher has to give. That yes, you can manage your family as well as you can do justice to your profession. And that was the mindset of the society. With time, this has happened that today, when during the pandemic, I have looked at the role played by my teachers. The first thing which I did, well, as I was saying, that we are slowly opening up and we are trying to come back to the normal life, the first thing I did was I thanked the families involved. I said, today, if my lady teachers, they have contributed to such a great extent, it would not have been possible without the support of each and every member of the family. And that's why the credit goes to them, that the perception has changed. Everybody has moved forward. If the lady of the house is busy with some professional commitment, it is the other gentlemen or the boys in the family, they are giving the desired support. And that is how we have been talking. Coming to one more specific thing which we have talked about is the contribution in STEM education. So as I was distinguishing between the choice of toy to the choice of profession and contribution. So we have had research and development wing in everything, even to the industry. The best of the brains in industry, when I talk to children, I tell them that the best of the brains will eventually go to R&D. And they are the ones who are going to give the direction in which direction the industry is going to move. And with streams involving technological interference, It's not an interference, rather the involvement to such an extent where there is no dearth of potential, there is no discrimination, and the girls at every stage have been able to prove. Just few days back, I was talking to a friend of mine whose daughter is in grade 5, and you think of a process which goes through the mind of the child. The child says that I need to get into, there is a project which has come as a part of NEP and the government policies calling opening of scenic schools for the girls, which was the entry was restricted only to the boys earlier. Now scenic schools, which are kind of military education, they are being opened for the girls. So the child aims and dreams that I'm going to be in armed forces or in police, and my first step will be that I'm writing an entrance examination and I want to take admission in scenic school. Something which was considered dominant by the male, I'm going to step into that and prove myself. So this is the transformation which we are seeing. We are happy that we are living in this age, and I'm sure that we are all going to contribute to this, and there is no stopping the growth of the girl child.
Wonderful, wonderful words, Sanjay. I really enjoy hearing you talk about the need and the opportunity for change, and that there are really powerful things happening in this space. And I think it's certainly sometimes actually the way that you talk about the need and the passion for that change, they are actually sometimes conversations I would love to hear also happening here in Australia. We're going to stick with a little bit of that focus on just the space of sort of schools and school teaching. By now, I'm going to come to you, Damian, particularly hearing from you about your work in STEM punks, given that you do a lot of work with schools both across Queensland, Australia, and now in many parts of the world. I'm interested to hear from you. How does gender play a role in the work you do with schools?
G'day, Hamish, and it's great to be on a panel like this today, so thanks for the opportunity. Now, in terms of having genders inside of our programs, we bring it right back down, and we like to theme the programs initially. So I'll give you an example. If we're doing a design a reef program, we get the students to actually break down what a reef would look like. And then we give a student the problems, and then we get them to start learning about the STEM tools, and then they can design their own solutions. So essentially, we don't necessarily try and break it up into boys and girls, but we are going to be making a girls program, in the near future. But predominantly, we like to theme the programs and really let those girls tackle the problems. From my experience, typically the boys just like going straight in and try and fix things, whereas girls would like to understand the problem a little bit more. They'd like to understand why are we doing a circular economy? What's the point of it? And then they'll unpack that a little bit more, whereas boys would just like to go in and get the STEM tool and start fixing. But that's why at the start of it, we like to get the design thinking going, and we bring everyone back down to the same level, and then we go, right, there's your STEM tool, here's your problem, how are you going to solve it? So it's not us giving them a one answer question. It's how are you going to solve this problem? And these are the tools that we're going to teach you. So it's a fun little time to be in. And as he said, like from predominantly doing face-to-face, now going teaching students all around the world, it's a bit of a trip, but it's a lot of fun.
Good to hear, Damian. And also, so I'm going to come back to you later too, because I know that both within your work at STEM punks and across actually your team, you've been a lot of work in this space, looking at gender and even some recent publications that you've been focusing on. So I will come back to you on that. But actually, I'm actually going to stick just with Australia for a moment. Actually, I'm going to come to you, Mary, because you actually have a very broad focus here on Australian society through your research. And I'm thinking now, where children start in schools, particularly in Australia and in India, and then what actually happens over the progression of their lifetime. I think it's important in terms of a question I have for you is for people to understand how are work patterns in Australia gendered?
Well, they are gendered, and we do have traditional male and female areas of employment, and those patterns have persisted. So we tend to see women working, are more likely to work in healthcare, social assistance and education. And although men tend to be more prominent in leadership roles across industries, we do find that there are more women leading in the traditional female areas of work. If we look at education, you can see a change as you move from early childhood, which is dominated by women, and you see a few more teachers in primary school who are male, but still predominantly women. I think it's, I did write the figures down because I'm terrible at remembering them, but I think it's 80%. And secondary school, more male teachers. University, you've got more women working as lecturers, but they tend to be at the lower levels, and it's the middle level where you get the intersection, and then the professoriate, it's still male dominated. So, and you've got to think what message that gives to young people in terms of where they see people being positioned, and I guess the kind of modelling that brings.
Thanks very much, Mary. And I think that's a perfect segue in actually coming to you, Malika, because as a celebrated tech entrepreneur yourself, I'm very interested to hear about what has been your experience, particularly how perhaps gender has played a role in the amazing work that you've done, and how did your education help shape some of those possibilities for you?
Well, thank you for such a kind introduction. And I have to say, what does one say about the longest ongoing civil war humankind has been fighting, which is gender, right? I represent the 23.3% of board positions that are now held by women globally, which is up from 20.4 in 2018. And it's very positive, but it's definitely not something we're celebrating. And much like our numbers at school, I reckon gender parity to begin with remains a concern for young girls at school and women at work alike. And that's the first thing I'd like to address, because when international governing bodies that we end up working with envision concepts such as Mission Education 2030, prioritizing more numbers of girls in school aiming at equality in their one-line mission statements, I think we definitely need to stop, scrap, and start choosing the right words to define our goals. I think over time we've interchangeably, and I'm just going to assume mistakenly, continued to use parity, equity, and equality. Equality is giving everyone the same thing. Equity refers to giving people what they need. Parity is a numeric figure, which states nothing about equity or equality, yet is equally important. And if we miss the mark, if we don't take the opportunity to talk about why equity needs to exist, because we operate in a society, in a system that is inequitable. So my background of playing tennis, growing up in an all-girls school, a sport predominantly dominated by men, at least when I was playing it about 15 years ago, taught me that. Because at school, my punishment for playing tennis was being replaced for the part of Snow White, despite being best suited for the role, because I was tanned. Instinctively, the narrative communicated verbally, visually, through the multiple hours in the day, accompanied with a frivolous formula that stated good girls don't play tennis. And that was a formula, right? Because tennis equals tan plus muscle plus unattractive equals no marriage, which in an inequitable society was the classic definition of a bad girl. So at tennis, I mean, at school that happened to me, but at tennis, my male friends got way more severely punished than us girls ever did. Physical punitive measures taught the boys more than the girls, even though we were watching, so it subconsciously stayed with us, that if one did anything wrong, being rude and aggressive was justified. So I reckon education's been unfair for both genders, but two major lessons were learned young. Women can be replaced, was taught to us. Men got trained to be beaten down to the ground, but they were expected to stand up again, rest assured, never replaced. So it's safe to say I spent far too much time at the courts, my parallel school of sport, which I'm eternally grateful to my parents for putting me into, and the results are evident. Every fall, I learned to stand back up, and I can promise you, you may see me being bashed up in a boardroom, but you do expect me to stand back up. As for numbers, the parity for women in entrepreneurial spaces and having better role models in STEM, impressioning young minds, great idea. I'm so glad people are talking about this now. It's long overdue. I've been a big advocate, the narrative that we create through my companies. always have equal number of women-led commercial narratives, irrespective of the field they represent. But it's going to take much more, I reckon, at the grassroots levels. To achieve gender equity, academics need to accept first that what they comprehend as unfair needs to stop being communicated. Then we need to retrain our teachers to teach children young that careers don't have genders, balance sheets are not less forgiving to anyone, ethics, responsibilities. Teach them how to make choices, because I'm saying this as a woman that, I mean, we're very proudly celebrating today and I'm really grateful for it. But you may not regret, because it's such a big word, every decision you make. But having careers in an inequitable world with lesser female representation, you find yourself questioning the worth of every choice you make more often than not than men do. So that becomes a challenge on an everyday basis. But also start exposing, say, for example, connotations attached with being heroic, not necessarily insinuating to masculinity, or aggressive, rendering itself to being pushy when used in context for women. I think we need to end communicating to generations that girls can't make it to school because they have special needs. I think that is the most redundant statement, excuse, whatever you'd like to call it, because sanitation is a fundamental right, as is education, gender irrespective. And why we need to end using words like that is because we've started to normalize through education, strapping off rights of young girls, expecting them to growing up into women and have history repeat themselves, this time a little bit more subtly by strapping them off to the right of safety, which I reckon is a bigger concern than empowerment, that we've been carpeting to sound more inclusive and make even more money. You see, what happens is that empowerment helps make people make noise. Marketing campaigns with multiple design agencies siphoning money, implementing laws doesn't cost that much. Sanitation costs even lesser. Stationing police officers to do their job, protect women, which they're paid for as a part of their mandate, actually costs nothing more than what you're already paying the system to do. Coming from a country where we have 40% female representation in science at undergraduation levels, and existing celebrated names like Tessie Thomas, Chandrama Saha, Mangla Mani, Dr. Karuna Jain, our former defense minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, now finance minister, is more than enough proof to the fact that I've been saying this for so long, that women, I reckon, do not need empowerment. Stop making money on that agenda. Women who wish to be empowered are empowered. And over centuries, I've seen women, whatever you'd like to call them at that particular period, because, you know, whatever term is trending at that point, rebel, you know, whatever. Women have been making choices. They take a little bit longer because they're trying to find the right people to invest in to build their ecosystems to success. And that's something that I've been following as well. Being an entrepreneur, do I find developments more supportive of women? On paper, yes. There's a lot of money orbiting under that title. In principle, no. Exactly like school, at work, gender equity should be considered a procedure that enables success for where talent exists, understanding that you don't see all men in a boardroom or, you know, representing sport, which are my forte. You will not see women everywhere. Once we're successful in bringing a child to a school or an adult to work, acknowledging that each success story coupled with hard work requires a certain aptitude, identifying that and allowing it its space, educating that, skilling that focusing on that fortune is what we understand. And do not, you know, deny that we need more girls at school. But I think that is what we need to sort of work on through our irreparable, stubborn, inequitable systems. Setting goals like women belong in a boardroom. I'm seeing that floating around everywhere in education missions. I have a big problem with it because, number one, only being in a boardroom does not equal success. We could have an all-women board, which fortunately my company is very proud to have, but it's what the women do inside that makes a difference. Number two, it takes their focus away from what they need to do at every step. So let's invest in teaching them what it takes at each step before they get to being in a boardroom. And then how do you retain that? because I speak with a lot of women, I educate and train and, you know, sort of help them career counsel. But so many girls, young women, men and boys alike have no understanding that paternity leaves exist. They're up for grabs, but they're not being grabbed. Why are they not being grabbed? Ask those questions. Do women have rights when they are choosing to become working mothers? Yes. How many women understand that? Invest the money that we are investing in making noise, in telling people that these rights exist. And number three, which is also equally important, is taking away from the men to give to the women is also by no means equal to anyone. It's going to have a backlash of its own. We make the same mistake when we prioritize women in certain roles as we do for more girls in schools. Number alone is not going to make a difference. It's how we engage and include them within systems that matter. So gender parity, according to me, is not enough. It's a combination of equity and equality. So all three go hand in hand. Last but not the least, repeating generational failures we have conveniently, wealthily gotten away with by raising money on the same agenda over and over again without moving a single muscle towards action is appalling, but also excites me as an adult now, having, you know, gathered the education that I have at University of Melbourne and my college in London again after, and has triggered me to work towards a single end aim of triggering gender neutral digital e-learning, not just for the boys and girls, but this time I'm hoping and I'm praying that we can also include the transgender community, rewrite existing communication, create unaddressed content for representation for those who are born a certain gender and don't identify with, and also include the differently abled child going forward. Let me leave you with the thought that if you imagine a world where we educate our boys that girls are as strong, and we educate our girls that boys are as emotional, you see the difference. The governing bodies won't like this non-money making idea, but if you know, you know.
Thank you so much, Malika. I think you've absolutely raised the bar in terms of your personal experience, your understanding across so many different fields that you've worked in, the way you've read different parts of the landscape. And I think your passion and your conviction actually is exactly what we need. And actually, before I sort of circle back to some other questions, I'm actually going to kind of come to my co-host, Tanya Spisbar, because I know, Tanya, you would love to have Nishta here, but I've got to say, you're a pretty impressive late stand-in, if I can come to you, Tanya, because I know that you and I have talked about, particularly around this work of the SDGs, and it actually picks up on what Malika has said. You know, SDG 4 about equality education, and then straight after it, SDG 5 on gender equality. Tanya, would you mind maybe commenting on your impression of how do you think we're going at a level around this approach of the SDGs? Because we've only got, you know, 10 more years, or less than 10 years till 2030 to try and hit them.
Look, it's a really interesting point, Hamish, and thank you for inviting me to speak. It is unfortunate that Nishta's not here. What I'm going to do is quickly summarise some of her views in the UN Women Office in India, and then I'm going to put my Australian delegate for the Women's 20 hat on for the G20 summit and discuss some of the issues there as well. So briefly on Nishta's views in UN Women, she put out a very interesting article earlier in the year capturing a synopsis of 2020 and how India's move towards digitisation of education, as we've also done in Australia, has triggered greater disparity between men and women and access to education. So in her argument, she thought that COVID left behind more cohorts of women. According to the 2011 census, which is the last one on record in India currently, female literacy in India is behind male literacy by 16.6%. The Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation in 2017 put out a report, Women and Men in India, that noticed much higher dropout rates of women, and more so surprisingly in urban than in rural households at ages 16 to 24. A mobile gender gap report was done that sort of overlays the education angle by just looking at access to mobile devices and the internet. And in that 2019 report, Indian women are 56% less likely to use mobile internet than men, and only 35% of active users in India are women. So that gives you an idea of, if education is being rolled out technologically, while there are strong gains for access and inclusivity in some ways, there can be disparity in terms of access, and also depending on countries in other ways as well. Malika touched on some very interesting points about menstruation and access and so-called safety for women in terms of sanitation, but there are also issues related to sexual violence and assaults as well. The new education policy that was rolled out by the Indian government last year has addressed a number of issues from primary school right up until tertiary education, and gender disparity has been one of them. So to India's credit, they have been looking at different ways in which they can increase gender inclusivity or access to schools physically. And that includes more sex education. It also includes more mobility safety, which is an issue in suburban and rural areas in India, more so than it is in Australia, though still can be a concern in Australia. But this is about, you know, safe passage on buses and things like that for girls to incentivize their participation in school. The other point about mobile access is, even if a home has mobile access, where the schooling from home took place in 2020 for 90% of for students last year, there was a disproportionate burden placed on girls to do home duties. So where they're at home and they're not at school physically, there was a pull factor to be pulled into doing home duties more, which again pulled them away from doing schoolwork that they might have otherwise been able to do had they been physically in the classroom. So those are some of the issues that UN Women is trying to address, both in terms of the education. They also have a very strong and active role modelling program, which includes women in employment, which Malika has touched on some of those issues as well, but also women in parliament. So when we think about leaders and representation, who do we see making decisions? Representation is not just important for role modelling, it's also critical for decision making. So when we think about policy shifts, including in the education sector, we need to think about what are the issues where we need structural reform, where we need changes in governance, and where we need different perspectives. And if by and large that focus or that policy decision making is being done from a more homogenous lens, it becomes very challenging to then perhaps change or empathise or understand the need for policy changes. When we look at representation across the board, one of the issues I'm very interested in is not just representation nationally, but then also internationally. Recently, India was nominated and elected to the United Nations Commission for the Status of Women in 2020 last year, which was a competitive process within the United Nations Economic and Social Council. So this Commission on the Status of Women has been established since 1946. And yet, when we look at the UN General Assembly secretaries, over the past 70 years or more, only 4 of them have been presidents. To India's credit, the first female president of UNGA, the UN General Assembly, was Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, an Indian, but we currently have a male again. So we talk about representation, we talk about how seriously the G20, the G7, the OECD, and the United Nations takes parity. And I point to these international institutional examples, one, because India and Australia both pride themselves on being global leaders, either in Australia's case as a middle power, or India as an emerging global superpower. And yet when we look at these very conscious decision-making bodies, we find that leadership at the top has not really followed through. This year, in the UN ECOSOC, or the Economic and Social Council, the 2021 priority theme for women is fully and effective participation in decision-making and public life. And yet again, recently, you might have seen over the weekend, the new OECD Secretary General is again a male. So the OECD has never had a women leader either. These are some of the things we really do need to think about. I've talked about role modelling at an international setting, but whether it's international or domestic, touching on Mary's point, looking at traditional sectors of employment, all these things interrelate. International organisations are important because countries are member states. They play guiding roles for national implementation. When we think about COVID, I've talked a little bit about COVID education and access, but even if we think along economic lines, we've been talking about the green recovery, for example. For Australia, a green recovery means greater participation in the green economy through lithium and cobalt mining to support electronic motor vehicles, which is fantastic. So we're looking at innovation and technology. But if we go to Mary's point about the differences in, say, siloed sectors of men versus women, what we're talking about is the mining of critical resources. So the mining sector, we're talking about engineering, if we're going to add value. We're talking about export of primary commodities. These are all male-dominated sectors. So even if we're looking at how we're upskilling and investing in STEM and skills, which is part of Australia's education recovery plan, we need to be mindful that that 21st century recovery, which looks clean and green and climate friendly, may actually be against our gender objectives. So those are just some thoughts I'd like to leave you with.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And I think it's, I'm sure for many of our panelists and our viewers, you can agree that through a lovely piece of serendipity, we've got a lovely opportunity to hear the incredible knowledge and understanding that Tanya has of this space. So thank you for highlighting not only the somewhat shocking statistics on just how far we've got to go around some of the SDGs, but also some of the system pressures that we're facing. And in that notion, I want to sort of do another lap of the panel and actually come back to you again, Chris, because again, with what you've just heard, you know, I think for many teachers, whether you are male or female, there are often many challenges at work here. And I'd love to then hear from you, Chris, about what do you think are some of the most, what's most challenging about some of the gender considerations that sort of come to you through teaching or what you've seen over your career?
Yeah, absolutely. Pedagogy as a whole, when we talk about how we differentiate for students, gender is only one way in which teachers put a lens over, you know, their everyday classroom actions. And I think it's kind of where our RAM maxes out as teachers, because we're dealing with the, you know, applications of gender and pedagogy, but also a range of other things regarding the needs of students, the different levels of anxiety or stress that they might be going through, their cognitive ability, emotional state, so forth. So, so gender is one lens, and I think my appreciation of pedagogy has shifted over time. I really acknowledge my conscious bias that I've had. I was educated in an all-boys school. I've gone through and I've taught at co-educational schools and single-sex schools throughout my career, and I've seen the way in which pedagogy has applied to varying levels of success. I think, you know, starting back on one side of the spectrum, we have that old school explicit instruction that I do, we do, you do, and I think it's quite a common pedagogy approach that we use for kids in Queensland and probably across the world. I think there's been a big shift towards that more teacher-facilitated inquiry. And I think when we start doing that, we start catering for a larger range of genders in the classroom. There's a really big boom to the very end of that spectrum, which is that student-led discovery learning. So I think the world that we live in, it doesn't categorize gender in terms of what you can access online in terms of your own education and how you take your own pathway. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of the programs that kids are accessing outside of the school environment, and the work that they do towards catering for different learning styles. And there's a plethora of different things available. In my context, so I'm at a co-educational school, a very large school. The Sunshine Coast, let's face it, it's a relatively well-off area. However, we have quite a mixed demographic. We have the qualitative data at our school, as well as the quantitative data, says that girls are achieving at a higher standard than boys at the moment. And I've seen this exacerbate throughout my career at this school, the 8-9 years. So in terms of the data, so we have 3 times more girls choosing the academic pathways like the International Baccalaureate program. Girls are aspiring to take leadership positions. One of our STEM captains, Sarah Savola, mentioned that she went to the National Youth Science Forum in Canberra and it was 70% girls. So they're taking their opportunities, and as a result, we've seen a large proportion of our population of boys actually start to pull back on their academic achievements. And so as a school, we decided to address that through a strategic approach to really knuckle down on why boys have 4 times more behavior problems than girls. Why are they not at, the age group, the really malleable, that really malleable time frame from years 7 to 9? Why are they not aspiring to do the things that we're seeing girls do? So we've done lots of things. We've talked about pedagogical approaches around, boys in movement, really reframing the classroom and making sure that there's not this one position that you teach in. But the key for boys and also for girls is forming strong relationships. And in my role as a teacher, the content will come if you can develop really strong relationships where they trust you first and foremost, and they believe that you're going to take them down a journey of learning. In terms of what we do in terms of our STEM faculty, so we've developed programs that really cater for 21st century learning, I think, in terms of developing students with skills beyond the academics, thinking about the cognitive skills they're going to need to thrive in our world, and developing programs that cater for education for purpose, which really link to getting kids to understand what the UN SDGs are, and connect with them and empathize with the greater world. The Sunshine Coast is a little bit like a bubble, and our kids struggle to think outside that bubble and understand the complexity of what's happening in our world. So we really encourage our students to think in those contexts, and we find girls as a whole really connect with the SDGs and are able to empathize and put themselves in other contexts. We take that design thinking framework, which starts with empathy, and then we start to overlay a lean startup program, an entrepreneurial program, bring in technology to prototype and create solutions. And that's where we see the boys really come alive. So the kinesthetic learning, that ability to kind of shift, often the boys move straight away from that problem to the solution. So what we've found is that in these sort of programs, the boys and the girls really complement each other. By the time you get to your final outcome, your pitch, and you're getting to sell your product, the skills that each team member brings, it works well as a whole. And I think that's the world that we live in now. You don't need to have skills across a really diverse range if you can gather together a team that complements each other. So, pedagogical approaches, we're kind of shifting down this teaching for thinking frameworks, moving past this idea of teacher being the one that has all the content and the knowledge and just sharing it as pieces of the puzzle, but really starting to get students to think about how do we connect pieces of knowledge and form their own understandings of the world. But I'm not here to tell people how to teach, because one thing I've learned is that people know their kids and they know the right approaches for the kids that are in front of them. And you need to, cater for that diversity of the population that we see on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Chris. A really wonderful, balanced, detailed approach. And I'm glad you actually talked about, both sides of those elements around the role of gender, but also actually just about what good pedagogy can do to engage learners at different stages and ages. So I think a really, really good response. particularly sticking with the space of schools and probably shifting more into the beyond just the students that might be in front of a teacher, but actually looking at the teaching workforce. If I can come to you, Sanjay, interested particularly in your experience and your experience in your school about how role modeling, particularly looking at how women have different teaching positions, particularly in STEM, but also in leadership positions, either in your school or what you've seen in education in your career.
Put it in two different aspects. As I was talking about when it comes to empowering and role among the students in leadership. And I will begin it with the process of enrollment, which was one of the points which Malika had talked about. When we look at the enrollment in our city, of course, it's the policy. As a policy, the decisions have been made that neighborhood should be given due consideration. And when it comes to point allocation, in order to make it fair and in order to increase the enrollment, we as a school have adopted to the policy where girl children, they are given additional points, I would say. But of course, keeping in mind that it does not turn into a kind of a bias, it has encouraged enrollment, and the enrollment starts, that is the, I would say, entry level, moving on to the journey till secondary level or graduating level from school. That's where we see that what is the percentage of girls who are actually opting for STEM education, what is their role in leadership in various positions, and then I will come to the staff as well. So I have an observation that somewhere around 25 to 30% of our girls who enroll initially, maybe at the enrollment level, the girls and boys, they are about 50%. But by the time they come to senior secondary and when it comes to the choice of stream in terms of STEM education, the numbers have become encouraging now. Earlier may have been a smaller fraction, but now there are about 25 to 30% of the girls who are opting for STEM education. And in order to give them that experiential learning, in order to bring that experience in their life and motivate them, we have systems, and it is again a part of the government policy. There is something called Niti Aayog, which has established adult tinkering labs in India. And this is these tinkering labs, which are, I may call it as the experience centers. Experience centers where children would simply walk in and they have all kinds of equipments available, and you learn and you play and you create. So once that kind of exposure started coming and the entry is open and encouragement is there for everyone, so that started increasing the involvement of girl children and their interest, and definitely their creation was visible to it. So these are the steps which were taken. There are national level programs, like I would say that even the university and the higher education bodies, they joined and they have recently created something called as Vidyarthi Vigyan Manch. I am using the Hindi term, but it is basically student driven a drive which is talking about science education, STEM education, and empowering them. And they do conduct various activities. They invite students' participation and they give them due recognition. My observation when it came to recognition was, and in terms of the contribution made, you will have to believe me that the contributions which were made by girl students, they were far better in terms of not quantity, but in terms of quality. And that was something which has been acknowledged. We talk about something called as, there is a national assessment for scientific temperament and aptitude that has been termed as NASTA under the aegis of something called as CAM, Knowledge and Awareness Mapping Platform. And there is so much of popularization, such a big drive which is happening, that every year the enrollment of students, it is increasing, the involvement is increasing, and the schools and the children and girls particularly, they are contributing a lot. When you talked about SDG, I am happy, I'm here to share with you that yes, SDG runs in our DNA. This is how we have adopted. The moment SDGs were adopted in India, my school is the one which has adopted it in our DNA, and we believe in only one word when it comes to SDG education, is outreach and action. It is not just learning about the principle, but what can we bring in terms of society outreach, what can we bring in terms of action. And we do have our girls who are SDG ambassadors, SDG warriors, SDG activists, and they have even earned, as I said very rightly in the earlier context also, that the girls have earned their place and they have taken part in, coming from space science background, I have seen my children, they have taken part in NASA Space App Challenge, they have taken part in ISRO cyberspace competition. My girls are national level shooters. They are taking part in international competitions. They play squash, they swim, they play football, they play cricket. So Valika, we are encouraging every girl child who wants to play any odd game which they wish to do. And I'm
Thank
sure
you,
that this is what makes you delighted. So these are some initiatives. Coming to teaching fraternity. I will give you a fact side of it also. In India, if you look at the statistics, you will find that the teaching field is predominantly, the female teachers are significantly large in number as compared to male members. Now, there are reasons for that. And this is where we definitely draw the attention of the policymakers also. Maybe it was the way teaching started in India and the way enrollment started. For male members, it did not look all that lucrative a career in the beginning. One simple aspect, lack of motivation, of course, is there, and that motivation comes with financial input as well. Because it is understood, it was the society structure was such that it is perceived. A male member has to lead the family and he has to provide the financial support to the family, and maybe the kind of earnings which were coming were not good enough, and that was not attracting significant number of male members, and that's how a number of female teachers started growing. But those again were the days. Times have changed, and of course there are drives, and NEP very enthusiastically focuses about attracting the best brains into teaching, because that is what will really contribute to nation building. And there is, at least I would say, the male percentage which is coming into the teaching fraction in India is increasing. Still it is predominantly the females, and definitely the leadership role comes. When I have to select a school council, you won't believe that it becomes a difficult task for us to select a head girl or a president of student council among the female candidates, because there are so many of them who deserve, and whose profile, if you start looking at it, it becomes difficult for us to select. While coming to leadership choice among the boys, we might have limited number of applicants. This is the experience even my fellow educators in India, they do have. So this shows how the girls have built their profile, how they are capable, and they are recognized as leaders. So we as educators, we do not shy away in giving them any opportunity, and we are here to make them flourish, so that, again, I go back to my first line, that if we educate the girl, it is eventually the nation which grows.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Again, a really wonderfully rich response. And I think one of our challenges right now is the time that we almost don't have left to try and make sure that I do want to come back and hear from Damian, Mary, and Malika again, just briefly before. I know, Tanya, you want to wrap up. We've got some really wonderful questions coming in from some of our audience too. So if our panelists too, you could always jump in and see if you can answer some of those questions. But Damian, just to come to you, particularly, I mentioned before, and I'll just put it into the chat. You know, your latest issue that looks at STEMinism, and I suppose, of course, there's a really powerful statement there about the function of role models, particularly female role models in STEM. Tell us what you've been observing through your work in STEM punks in this space.
So number one was that it was an interesting point that Mary brought up before about there was around 80% of teachers are female in Australia. I thought it was a little bit less though. I thought it was around 70 to 80. So we know that there is enough role models that are in schools. It's just right now that how do we get this right information to these teachers to be able to be these role models? And here's the thing, like last year, we went into this weird phase of lockdown, right? Now, at the start of 2020, no teacher, well, not a lot of teachers took a lot of buy-in from this online education. Now, every single teacher in Australia can do online education. So now the world's a lot smaller, and we've got so many resources that these mentors can actually get to these kiddos anywhere in the world. They could be regional, rural, doesn't matter where they are. So that the mentors, these female mentors, they're accessible now where they may not have been accessible before. And the important part to that is that they need to make it relevant and exciting to the students that are going to be receiving this. Because if a student goes in and they go, look, why am I doing this kind of program? Or if I'm doing a coding program, what's the point of this? I think we need to make these programs not only engaging, but exciting for these guys to go, hey, look, I'm down. Now I can actually see how this works out in industry. So that's the pathway. So not only is this perception that we've got to break down that STEM is just engineering, that we're all going to go off and build bridges, we've actually got to start bringing this perception down to what it actually is. There's so much design in it. There's so much artists that going into it. There is so much beautiful things that go into it that can make it a lot of fun. But then if we're bringing these back into these industry connections, we can actually show students, right, this is geothermal energy. This is solar energy. But this is how you actually can put solar energy onto a house that's going to impact a family or a village in Vanuatu. So it's making these connections that from industry to student by making it really engaging and exciting. I know we got cut short of time, so I'm not going to waffle on, but that's what I'm saying, man. Like, just got to make sure these programs are engaging and exciting, and make sure there's the industry connections, and that's what's going to boost these careers, and that's what's actually going to get these girls to really want to go into these careers in STEM.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much, Damian. And again, you know, the great work that you do and the way that you've highlighted it in your latest Future Learning magazine is just fantastic. Mary, if I can just come back to you just for a moment, because I know that a lot of your research is also focused on how the notions of merit and achievement affect professional progression. And have you got any comment to make, particularly on education, but also, of course, we're talking about systemic challenges here that I'm sure are very well known to women, but again, it's often not articulated. So could you just speak to that point for just a moment?
Yes, and I will be brief. I think there's a couple of things that are really important. One is girls are achieving at school. They are doing well at school, but it's what's happening after school that's important. So even boys who do not succeed at school have really good opportunities. I'm talking about Australia, if they go to apprenticeships, whereas it's girls who don't succeed at school who actually have far worse outcomes. So we need to look at what's happening in the workplace. And I think there's a couple of things we need to take account of. One is the social settlement that we have in Australia about how care work is organised. And Nancy Fraser, as a philosopher, talked about different models where it's shared, where it's contracted out, or you've got a breadwinner model. And we've got a modified breadwinner model in Australia where women, no matter whether they're working full-time or part-time, are responsible for the bulk of care of family, of children, and they do a lot of the thinking work, the organising work, and that has become so obvious as we've experienced the last year with lockdown and how that burden has disproportionately impacted on women. There's also, you know, you can't miss it from the media, looking at discrimination that happens in workplaces, and, you know, towards including assault in Parliament. So unless you address some of these bigger questions about our social settlement around care, what we think of as an ideal worker, if an ideal worker in any industry is someone who is unencumbered, who has no real responsibilities for children or for elderly parents, then that is going to set up an expectation that is going to be very difficult for a woman who is engaged in community and family, but also for a man who wants to live there. So I think we've got a number of much bigger issues that we need to deal with that go way beyond the schools. Oh, and I didn't mention merit, but that links in very well, because if we have ways of measuring achievement that have got built-in biases, then you are going to systematically limit opportunities. And intersectionality is important, as has been picked up in the chat, because the opportunities to a privileged middle-class girl are not the same as the opportunities available to an Indigenous girl who is living in a remote area, or from someone in the western suburbs of Melbourne who are first in their family to go to university.
Absolutely, Mary. Yes, again, so articulately said. Malika, I'm actually going to come to you, and then I'm going to bounce straight to you, Tanya, to close out. Malika, If there is one bit of advice you could give female tech entrepreneurs, what would it be?
Great. I think this one's the easiest one. Thank you. I think I just want them to know that when you get into a career, like I said, I'm going to give this example of how we've suddenly had such a large brigade of female fighter pilots that India has just realized that we can have women who can fly planes. Because up until now, our countries have this image of a man flying a plane he's flying, but a woman flying a plane is almost like she's going to carry it on her shoulders. But like, how will she carry it, right? Like, so I guess for women, they just need to know that the equipment you're using, be it an aircraft, be it guns, like they said, I'm seeing so many people who are doing professional shooting, your sporting equipment, whether you choose to become a doctor, whether you choose to run a business, like I said, my balance sheets are not going to give us a female discount. So they just need to know that if there is something that they want to do, please go out and do it. I have to tell all the women out there that more men have supported me than women have. So they have nothing to worry about when it comes to gender equality at work. If you know your ethics, if you know your responsibilities, and if you're kind to each other, I feel like there's no need to be scared of each other, because like I said, there are far too many men who are supportive of women at work, and they actually help us balance out our personal lives and our professional lives. So please go out, take that big risk. And I also want to say that if you don't have anything to add to the system, please stay home. It's totally fine. It is not demeaning for a woman to stay home and take care of home, because I really don't think men can run it as well as women can. And there's nothing wrong in women not working also. So you don't have to go out there to prove your worth to someone. If you don't want to do it, it's your choice. But like I said, being on top, being in a boardroom does not equal success. You can also not be in a boardroom and be equally change making, which is what I think the world needs a lot more.
Well said, Malika. I love your positivity and your passion. It just shines through. Tanya, over to you.
But I also have to add, sorry, but I have to add, having played sport and studying in Australia, I think that is where this has happened, because I think in Australia is where I learned, coming from a country where women have a lot of, barriers in India. But I think Australia is where it taught me that you need to raise children equally, and every individual is as human as the other. So you start working on their qualities and their talent. And I think combined with sport, it just sort of helps you grow better. So yeah, just grow up equally.
Wonderful. Well said. Tanya, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for such a fascinating and rich discussion. Hamish and I were thinking about how we wanted to model this particular panel, and I don't think we could have selected better speakers. Multidisciplinarity really is key to addressing equity issues, and all of you coming from either a policy perspective, an education perspective, or having been a product of the education system as entrepreneurs, you've all brought something really fresh and original to this discussion. I'd like to close out by just highlighting, I think, some of the issues that were raised, as it was quite broad and rich. I don't think I'm going to try and pull it together in a synthesized way, but just to highlight some of the key points. I do apologize for missing out on some of the questions that have been posed by the audience, but some of them did raise numeracy and parity between men and women performance, and also looked at career level entry points for women in STEM in Australia. So I think some of these points have largely been discussed already. If not, hopefully the speakers can take it forward in the chat. I was really impressed by everyone, but I just wanted to highlight a few points. I think, Chris, you spoke about design thinking and starting with empathy, which led to a really good point about emotion and how we distance ourselves in our thinking from emotion. We talk about labour, market, economy, technology, innovation, impact, but we don't talk about the actual empathetic issues that really play into why we are doing this study or participating in the workforce, which is ultimately to support the human condition. We don't come back and do that touchstone. When we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to think about the human condition, humanity, and the planet as our ultimate objectives. I think both Chris and Damian brought out some really interesting issues to that end, talking about the complementarity between men and women. We've been talking about gender equity in terms of empowerment of women, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we don't want disempowerment of men, nor do we want to lose sight of that complementarity. So what I found interesting, teasing out of both Chris and Damian's points, were the idea that boys focus on the how, perhaps, problem to solution. Girls focus on the why. Why are we doing this? To what end? What will that impact be? And how can I get involved once I understand the purpose of what we're doing? So between how and why, there is a really natural synergy, and that type of complementarity should be teased out in the classroom, in boards, and more broadly in international governance and domestic governance. Malika's point on paternity leave, I just wanted to highlight that as well, because the sharing of home duties not only allows men and women greater equity in accessing the workplace if they choose, but children are not just a private home life responsibility or concern. They are, in fact, the future of our society. They are the next generation. They're also learning role modeling at home, and how we organise our home and how we organise the economy has a huge impact on the future generation that is the society of our 21st century. So in closing out, I want to highlight some key words. Action and outreach from Sanjay, who practices UN SDGs and empathy at his school, Alcon International, impressively. I think we've focused really on diversity, multidisciplinarity, and inclusivity. Malika tried to throw in transgender there at the end, and I think it's a very live and important issue as well. But I'll leave it with the broader concept of inclusivity. And I really thank everyone on this panel for their time and for creating such a rich discussion. Please stay tuned, everyone, for the next session, which AEF and AII will be working on, which really is a nice segue, education and equity and well-being, which after a year like 2020, I think all of us will be interested in how well-being plays a role. Thank you all.